Welcome back to Until All of Us Are Free, a year-long education project dedicated to Black liberation as collective liberation. I am your host and the creator of this project, Ijoma Oluwo. As part of our month-long focus on a lifetime of liberation work and how we really sustain this work over the long haul, I am so excited to finally bring you this great conversation I had with Alexis Pauline Gumbs a few months ago. Alexis Pauline Gumbs is an amazing writer, scholar, poet, and activist. And we are talking about what this work means to us as Black women and what it has meant for some of the amazing Black women that have come before us. And in that, we are also discussing her amazing new book, The Eternal Life of Audre Lorde. I really loved this conversation. I've been thinking about it and referencing it for weeks since we last talked. I know that this conversation was super valuable for me, and I know it will be for you as well.
I'm Alexis Pauline Gumbs. I am a queer, Black, feminist, love evangelist, aspirational favorite cousin to all life. I'm a writer and a scholar. I'm committed to us being able to access generations of love in every moment.
I love that so
Yeah.
much. This project centers around collective liberation, especially in the context of Black liberation. What does collective liberation mean to you?
Well, I mean, you have you have it in the title of your project. I think about Fannie Lou Hamer, nobody's free until everybody's free, right? That was part of her ecological wisdom as a farmer, as a person in deep relationship with the land. She understood that freedom was collective and also that exploitation is collective, right? It's the people who are playing multiple roles in these systems who she says are shackled to each other through those systems, but it's also the animals and the plants and the soil and the rivers. All of that is being actually shackled and constrained by these intersecting systems. And I actually see the Black feminist tradition and the work of Black women and femmes even before the name Black feminism was invented as examples of what collective liberation looks like, what it means to participate towards a more life-giving world. And you see this in the consistent coalition building from Harriet Tubman to Ida B. Wells. There is a logic of collectivity that is part of the ethos, the strategy, and the practice of these folks who understood their possible freedom, joy, well-being, spiritual expression as connected to the possible joy, well-being, spiritual expression of all life on earth.
It also makes me think of this kind of conflict with, I think, the way a lot of the world, especially the US, thinks about Black women and their roles in resistance, right? Because I do think there is a difference between seeing your liberation as connected versus the way I think a lot of, especially the left, wants to see Black women as tools of liberation or as like the caregivers, the nannies of liberation to just kind of take it
Mm.
through for everyone else instead of one, recognizing what we know we've always had to do for survival, but also recognizing why we do what we do and not necessarily of this innate, selfless, I am here to save the world, but I see liberation and that requires liberation across the board.
Yeah, exactly. It's really the expansiveness of the vision of these Black women practitioners of freedom that is what left movements are overlooking when they try to make it fit into a subservience logic. And I think that what is at stake inside of that is those people who are making that mistake of thinking that it's actually Black women have some kind of subservient sacrificial role in collective liberation are actually not willing to take on an expansive vision of their own freedom and the transformation that that requires and the vulnerability that that requires. I think that what happens is it reveals how people who cannot imagine themselves, right, outside of a white supremacist colonialist definition of individuality and separation.
It reminds me as well of like one of the fundamental like flaws of whiteness is that whiteness as an identity, it's a power structure
Right.
outside of everything else. And then second, it's a purely comparative identity.
Mhm.
It's not an intrinsic self-defined identity. And that means like it's really hard for I think white people to project themselves into a future that they get to define for themselves, and a future that
Mhm.
is based on relationship instead of power. Whiteness is a default in a power structure that only works if you don't try to define it. And I think that we know more clearly who we are. And of course, there are varying degrees of that. People will disagree as to who we are. We know more clearly who we are, and it makes it easier to have a future to fight for.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the way Audre Lorde talks about it in her poem Coal, she says, "I am Black because I come from the earth's inside."
Yeah.
Right? Like this understanding that Blackness is not a reaction to whiteness, Blackness is a relationship with life itself, with the unknown and the potential of what could be possible. And I think that the problem with whiteness is that it actually presupposes that the source of power is domination of another group, as opposed to a relationship, an interrelationship with all of life. But white people are socialized to, and I want to say violently. I think that the enforcement of whiteness, this is really a logic of domination imposed through domination. And so all of these white people invested in whiteness are survivors of domination. And it has been basically bullied into them to understand that they should fear being dominated. And therefore, they have to invest in this ideology of domination because it's the only safety. And I think that that's tragic. And of course, it's also happening within white people across gender and across class and,
Mhm.
all of these things. But it's inherently violent.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
the idea of Blackness as relationship that we're talking about is actually inherently accountable. And, we have these moments where it's just like, this happens to me a lot when I'm watching sports, and I have those moments of like, why am I crying? Like just every time like a Black gymnast or a Black track and field star wins, like, even if I'm not like particularly like a fan of the sport, and I'm like, oh, because it's a like intense experience of the collectivity,
Mhm, mhm,
you know? I don't feel that I'm alone or that that person's alone and fundamentally separate from me.
mhm.
And that is something that we have to practice more, certainly in relationship to each other, but across species. That collectivity that should be our general experience of life.
Right.
But when we recognize it, it's so profoundly emotional because
Mhm.
we understand this is what life is supposed to be all the time, is this experience of feeling profoundly connected, not through lines of patriarchal family,
Yeah,
not through institutional affiliation, but actually through the expression of life being
yeah.
itself.
It's funny because my mom is white, and when I built my mom a house, which was like, I think every Black girl's dream, right?
It
To
is a
build their
dream.
mom
It
a
is the
house.
dream.
I was
Yes.
so excited, and my mom was so
Congratulations, by the way.
thank you, and my mom was so weird about it, right? My mom who had worked multiple jobs, we'd struggled so hard to, like, help us. She was so weird, she kept saying, "I'll pay you back," or "I'll pay you rent," or I'll and I was like, "This is so weird," like, trying to get her to let go of this shame that,
Yeah.
like, she felt like she had failed, and I'm like, "This is what do you mean failed? You supported me, and we're in this space now where you can rest, you can relax, you can retire," And to her, she was always supposed to do things on her own, and it was like a power shift in a way.
That's the thing, right?
Mhm,
The idea that we are not inherently a part of this earth,
mhm,
that we don't have the dignity that our lives we deserve to be alive and well
mhm,
and live our lives. This is what whiteness says is you don't deserve anything
right,
and you have to earn the right to just live.
right.
which is that's the scam,
Yeah,
And, you know, for me, that was a hard thing to see because being socialized inside of capitalism, that is the logic. There's a constant threat that people don't deserve to live. They earn a living, right?
right,
That's what it's called. And for me, it wasn't until I went to Cuba and met and, was building with people who weren't raised with that idea. They were
right,
raised with the dignity that they deserve to live. They deserve to have an education. They deserve to have healthcare and well-being for their kids. They deserve it. Now, it might be a struggle, and it might be the embargo might be blocking it, and all of these things, but they understand that not just they, but everybody deserves that. And it was really a sea change for me because I was like, oh, I never saw that. Yes, this experience of Black collectivity and wanting to take care of each other, all of that. Yes, but it's criminalized
right,
inside of capitalism because of this idea that life is something you earn, not something that you have and express and interact with and participate in.
right.
It's a very narrow definition of life, and it's really designed that way in order to be able to manipulate people
Yeah,
and disempower people, as you said.
absolutely. And I think especially right now that becomes incredibly toxic because one, I think we are deliberately kept from our history, right? We are reduced to suffering. We are reduced to like individual heroes that pulled us through. And it's like our history is put into dark times and light times. And I think we also have erased that part of why we exist as Black Americans, as Black people around the world, is because we found joy every day. Like we still built families and communities and cared for each other and celebrated birthdays and had naming ceremonies. And we did all of these things at all points in our history. And we brought food to the sick, we cared for our elderly. And that the way in which that is, as you said, criminalized and demonized and shamed. When I think about I have friends who, would have rent parties, right, to get by, and people would be like, "Oh, I can't believe," well, like those don't even happen as much anymore. Now it's like it's a GoFundMe that people are always embarrassed to put out,
Right.
right?
Right.
And it used to be even when I was like in my 20s, it was a celebration. You had a rent party, you always knew what was up, right? People
Hmm.
people were struggling. And it was like, hey, what if we came together as a community and celebrated being together? And then we got someone through, the next couple months. Like, what if we
Right.
do that? And that was a beautiful opportunity to reconnect. And then it became replaced by these kind of capitalist tools, and then it became shamed. And watching that shift from hey, y'all know what time it is. Like, let's come together. Let's
Right.
get this done.
Let's dance and let's eat.
Exactly. Let's do that. When it shifts from that to here's a link, and I'm so embarrassed I have to do that. And here's the whole explanation as to what happened and why I might be worthy and how sorry I am. It's such a loss for our community. And right now, when every system we have that has been crumbling for a long time is now like getting that final push
Hmm.
over the edge. We have to break that idea that what we do to get by is shameful. We have to be able to reach together because this idea that we can't survive this. I was on the internet and I got so frustrated. Like the election had just ended. And there was a Black feminist site that just posted people are vastly overestimating their ability to survive this.
Hmm.
And I was like, why is that? First of
The
all, I
angle.
don't think
Right.
that's true. I feel like the panic I'm seeing everywhere, most people are like, "Let's just die now. Let's all collectively die." And I'm like and also, we have survived so much. We survived the Jim Crow South, like, we survived I'm Nigerian, like, my I come from survivors of genocide. Like,
Hmm.
what does that mean? If anything, we're vastly underestimating our ability to survive this.
I think that what's at stake there is a definition of survival, right? And
Mhm.
so this is what this biography of Audre Lorde that I wrote is called Survival is a Promise, The Eternal Life of Audre Lorde. And it has 10 sections and they each start with a definition of survival. So Audre Lorde's definition of survival is collective. And what she's saying is that we are here, and it's not a matter of how long do I individually inhabit this form, this embodied form. The question is, what is my energetic relation such that what she called the fund of energy that animates my life, that gets poured back in, after I'm in this form, actually rings beyond any one individual life. It's an idea of purpose. And so when you say we have survived, if you define survival as individual persistence, then what you said is not true, right? Then when you said what we have survived because of our connection to our ancestors is not a valid definition of survival, if survival is this small thing. I do think that there's a scarcity definition of survival that's tied to everything we said about whiteness that says, no, for you to continue to live, for your kids to continue to live, it's either you or someone else.
Right.
Somebody else has to lose for you to win. And the collectivity that we described is like, all that has to happen is someone to win for me to win, like that's part of my definition of winning. And I think what is scary, brave, and threatening to people who are attached to this scarce, small definition of survival is that the way people live, the freedom that actually exists through us when we don't define our survival as individual persistence, the decisions that we make, the generosity we can embody, the futures we can imagine, as you said, it's a whole other thing. When I think about collective liberation, I think about the mass meetings in Mississippi where sharecroppers are gathered in a church. Fannie Lou Hamer is there singing with them, really orchestrating everybody to raise their voice, right? To do this collective practice of singing together, congregational singing. And, they may come in as individuals. They're being threatened as individuals, right? The threats they receive, if you go and register to vote, you're going to lose this job. You're going to be kicked off this land. We're going to publish your name and location in the newspaper so that terrorists of white fear can come find you and kill you. This is the threat against the individual existence of these people who still decide and remember through the ritual act of singing together that survival is not individual. And they collectively go and they register to vote anyway.
Right.
They access this bravery because they're not individuals in those actions. They're not small, scarce people who can be threatened. Now, do the things still happen? Yes. Was Fannie Lou Hamer lose her job, kicked off of her land, brutally attacked, had people shoot through her window? Yes. So it's not to say that because they felt that way, that white fear didn't express itself as violence as it only can. But it didn't stop them from doing what you're talking about when you say we survived white racial terror in the segregated South. Because they included us in that we.
Right.
They were like, the we that's doing this is not all even in this church building. They're not all people we can see. They're not people who've been born. They're not even people who we can necessarily imagine. And that's what survival means. Living beyond the limit of individuality.
Right.
And so this is what Audre Lorde taught. This is what she practiced. And the reason that I want this book to be an accompaniment to everyone through this time, it's an opportunity to actually feel that accompaniment. And I'll just say my next project is actually about Fannie Lou Hamer, and in particular, the way that Fannie Lou Hamer mentored June Jordan into her theory that love is life force and love is what survives.
I love that.
And so the way that we invest in survival and practice survival is collective liberation. It's asking ourselves, what is love asking? What generates more love? What is consistent with the love that I've experienced,
Yeah.
And that is a very different set of standards for decision making than what do I do to try to prevent the domination that I feel is inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
It's very different ways you live, it's different ways you feel, it's different things you do, it's different relationships you have, depending on that definition of survival.
I love that. And you know, that reminds me when I think about Audre Lorde, I think about a thing I always try to remind people, like when I'm giving talks, is there are many ways to die.
Mm-hmm.
And death is not always physical. We will all die. And I think that Audre Lorde knew that even before she knew she had cancer. Like
Mm-hmm.
she knew she was going to die, as we all will die. But I think she was more afraid of the other ways in which Black people die, which isn't a physical death. It's
Mm-hmm.
it's the death of the spirit. It's the inability to actually live while we're here. And I would love to talk a bit about what it means for us to access that, as you said, immortality,
Mm-hmm.
really, that she knew she had as she was working.
Yeah, I mean, I do say that, that we all have that, right? We all are inherently interconnected. We all are stewards of an eternal energy. That is what I believe. I believe that that's not something that's special about Audre Lorde. That's something that is true about all of us. But she knew it. Like you said, we have the opportunity to study the life of a queer being who knew it. And the reality is that for Audre Lorde, what it meant to be a poet was to be in that space of relationship and transformation. And we can enter that portal at any moment. And I do every single day. I'm opening the collected poems of Audre Lorde and I'm like, where are we going? What aspect of myself did I not even realize I was connected to within myself? I mean, and I just have to say, because we're having this conversation on Toni Cade Bambara's birthday, what Toni Cade Bambara teaches us is that everything is happening on every scale. It's one thing happening, but it's happening on the scale of the bacteria, the
Mhm.
cells, this body, our collective body, the planet, the cosmos, the universe, all of it is one thing. And when we understand that, then we understand the true cost of this idea of separation.
Right.
Because I can't participate in this idea that I'm separate from you without separating myself from aspects of my own being.
And it makes me think too, in this particular time, what we're facing, I think very similar to like the civil rights movement, right? People were individually targeted, but the goal of the oppression was always collective, right? And the
Mm-hmm.
widespread ramifications was an oppression of an entire people, multiple peoples,
Mm-hmm.
and a structure of world order that impacted all people. And we are in that right now. And just like I think what we saw in the post-Reconstruction South and what we saw throughout leading up to the civil rights movement is we are seeing individual targeting to convince people that if you act a particular way, that will ensure your individual survival. And it gets us to ignore the fact that this structure, this machine, is actively working to ensure our collective oppression and our collective exploitation. And the more that we focus on individual survival, the stronger that machine gets. And I worry right now so desperately because I think we do this internationally, right? People are able to look at Palestine, to look at Congo, to look at Sudan and say that is separate from me, as if it could possibly be, right? But then also we see this now in the US, right? We see this with the individual targeting of people of color, of immigrants, of people who look like they
Yeah.
might be immigrants, with the individual targeting of pro Palestine protesters. And I know that the actual work is to collectively silence us
Yeah.
through individual self preservation.
Yes. And so, as you said, it obscures the fact that the goal is collective violence, collective repression. And it also seeks to obscure the fact of the collectivity of our movements. And I feel like that's why it's so important that Mahmoud Khalil said, if anything, my detainment is evidence of the success of our student movements,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because that's so clarifying. What it really shows is that not only did thousands and thousands and thousands and who knows, maybe millions of students inspire each other to act collectively based on their understanding of the fact that their liberation is connected to Palestinian liberation. it also shows that everybody else feels collectively invested in what these students have done and said. That collectivizing, the literal embodiment of the encampment, the rallies, the gatherings, the visibility of it, I think energized and re-energized so many of us, and then taught so many people who were the parents of those students, who are the professors of those students, who are the siblings of those students, the friends, the neighbors, to be able to understand that there's a possible way to be beyond isolation. And you're right. We're at a time where isolation has to be pageantized. It has to be enforced by violence because it's not real. That's how fragile it is. I mean, it's so fragile that children can push it over. You understand? And by attacking the students, that system of repression admits that fragility.
One thing I would love to ask, because art is so important to how we view the world. Art comforts us, art informs us, it guides us, and yet at the same time, art is often dismissed. And I think in these really stressful times, it's so interesting to watch people turn to poetry and painting and music for comfort while also saying, we have more important things to do. This isn't actually a part of revolution. And so thinking about your book, right? Thinking about your book right now in this context and the work of Audre Lorde and the life of Audre Lorde, what do you hope this offers to people right now seeking to get through these times and hopefully into something better for all of us?
I mean, when Audre Lorde says poetry is not a luxury, it's a skeleton architecture of our lives. She understands it to be how we actually build another understanding and another reality. It's a technology for how we actually understand something other than the narratives that have been used to oppress us. And, even the example I gave of Mahmoud Khalil in that one sentence, it's not a poem, it's a letter, right? But to say, actually, this doesn't mean that, it means this, that's the poetic act of possibility. Mm-hmm. There's another possible story, and in fact, infinite possible stories. And in the poetic practice, we become available to them. And, honestly, I think that the reason that people quote Audre Lorde's essays more than they do her poetry is because people are uncomfortable with and afraid of the transformational commitment of what poetry does. It's not, and obviously Audre Lorde's essays are transformational too, but to quote just the title of 3 of them, you feel like you're done. You did it. You clapped back, whatever, you answered it. And as you have said, and as this whole project is evidence of, collective liberation is not that. Collective liberation is forevermore. Collective liberation is an ongoing process because it exists in relationship. So it's not an achievement, it's a relationship. And, like you're saying, our relationships with our mothers, we don't achieve them and complete them. We may have milestones that are important in those relationships, but even after they pass away, their relationship is never over. Mm-hmm. And I think that can be scary. I think that part of the way that these systems of individuation, a small idea of survival, persist is that it's like they offer it to you as something that you could just buy it and you'll be done. Oh, surprise. You still are afraid, scarce, and fragile. How convenient. Because now you could just buy something else, right? Mm-hmm. And now you can make the ability to buy those things, the thing that you're addicted to and nourishing, and not the relationships that could transform your sense of who you are, not just once, but infinite times. So yeah, I think that that's what poetry is for, period. And I think that what's crucial about poetry in that definition of poetry is that it's not even as small as electing some different people. It's not as small as banishing a particular fascist or 3. It's actually a practice of being alive in relationship to everything. And That's not something that we then pat ourselves on the back and say we did it.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that we continue in the practice of. And I think that's the good news.
Mm-hmm. It's beautiful. I love that. And it reminds me of, I was talking with Saul Williams, and he was saying, a lot of people were really hoping that all of this work finished in the 60s
Mm,
and they wouldn't have to do it again. And it does remind me of what you're talking about, this kind of transactional idea, this product idea of liberation, where
right.
you fill out these steps and then you're done. And I think that one shuts down like how lengthy this and how forever this process is, but also it cuts the personal out of it, like the liberation that brings you closer to who you are, the liberation that has you re-envisioning yourself and your collective selves over and over again. That for me, when people say, what does liberation look like? I can say, I have no idea. Because right now I'm conditioned by this oppressive world that we're in. And as I get more free, my vision for liberation changes. And I can't
Right.
imagine that ever being done. And that's beautiful because that's an amazing, gorgeous privilege of a process to be a part of. And I think what people see instead is struggle
Mm-hmm.
and not getting more free, finding new ideas of how you can be and how you can be in relationship with the world forever. Like you get to do that forever. That's the beautiful part of this work that we often erase.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Audre Lorde shows us it is not only, wonderful, it's like sweet, it's pleasurable, it's, erotic, it is like lush. It just is this possibility of intimacy with life that is the point, and as you said, to live otherwise is its own form of death, a more dangerous form of death, and it don't have to be that way.
Thank you for joining me once again for another episode of Until All of Us Are Free, a year-long project dedicated to Black liberation as collective liberation. Be sure to check out our show notes at untilwearefree.com. There's a lot of really wonderful information on there, and it's also where you can find out more about Alexis Pauline Gumbs and her amazing work. And while you're there, you can choose to become a paid subscriber. Our goal is to make this content as best we can and keep it as accessible as possible. And your support really helps us do that. I would love to give thanks to Alexis Pauline Gumbs for joining me today and for Isabel Collini for her editing work. And thanks as usual to Gabriel Teodros for letting me use his music throughout this episode. I look forward to seeing you throughout this month for more conversations on lifelong liberation work. Take care of each other, and I'll see you next time.